Well, welcome to another edition of Fire and Training. I'm your host, Douglas Cline. We got a dynamic show, or actually a two-part series show that's going to dovetail into a colleague of mine with Buildings on Fire and Christopher Naum as we dynamically take on a topic and combine a couple of things together. So, taking it to the streets, Buildings on Fire and Fire and Training, collaboratively working together to provide the highest quality of education and knowledge out to our people in the streets. And again, I'm always honored to have a good friend and esteemed colleague, Christopher Naum, on the show. Chris, welcome on.
It's always a pleasure, Doug. Thanks.
You know, one of the things that we've done through the years is we've talked about a lot of different components, and we've hit several different things along the way as it goes to tactics and fireground operations, how you train, the buildings, the compartments, fire dynamics, the whole nine yards. I wanted to circle back around to a concept that has come back out and a lot of conversations being had about this out in the streets. And as dynamics begin to change in our world, especially in the firefighting world, with our buildings and with understanding the research even further, taking that research, translating it over into tactical deployments and strategies, we come back to the size up. And I think the size up is in the heart of every response. And we know that typically when we get into that, one of the biggest pieces that I think about is in the first 5 minutes. Everything that happens in that first 5 minutes of arriving on scene really dictates how this incident is going to go. And it's critical. And an effective size up is so paramount to understanding what you're up against and being able to truly look at that and take into consideration what your incident action plans are going to be, what your fireground communication plans are going to be. And there's a plethora of things that are out there. And I know that both of us involved in ISFSI in the time period when we did a lot of the research in Spartanburg and in the laboratories with UL and NIST, and of course, Governor's Island and the stuff going on in Phoenix, it all kind of came back to, again, size up. And size up is a very important factor that ties in. And most people don't think about that. But let's really go back and tie in. One of the biggest ones that I go back to was one that I learned many years ago. The concept and the analogy was talked about in the company officer programs that were done back in the 80s, early 90s in ISFSI. And again, this comes out in a textbook, which I know you'll talk about just a little bit, with the acronym COAL was wealth. So let's kind of take, and we're going to dive into that today. We're going to cover the COAL and WAS. COAL was. Part two, we're going to talk about wealth. And let's dive into how we're going to dovetail and tie these two programs that we both run into making a dynamic four-part series here.
Well, certainly, Doug, you laid the groundwork out for it. When we talk about size up, especially on today's fireground, it's becoming more and more challenging. It's becoming a reliability factor. And by that, I'm saying that, or suggesting even, is that we do have challenges regarding the reliability, the accuracy, the completeness of our size up. Size up certainly is a fundamental component of fireground operations. I'll mention a little bit about the historical process and sort of the originations and the genesis of it, especially in the context of what we're going to be discussing here today, which when we talk about the acronym of COAL was wealth, it's certainly very fundamental. But size up perspectives really fall within this whole cognitive process. We get into this whole issue of thinking, knowing, remembering, judging, problem solving, and a lot of it has to do with sensory applications. What are we seeing? What are we hearing? What are we smelling? What are we thinking? What are we recalling based upon these factors? And tying a lot of data points together regarding this cognitive process to give us some critical thinking. And that critical thinking, as you mentioned, Doug, really becomes the formative aspects of the incident action plan that we have now become very embedded with. But years ago, when size up first was being conceptualized and implemented in the evolving fire service of the 50s all the way up through the 1970s, it certainly has been a challenge at best, because we have some individuals who brought forward some basic modeling, some basic concepts, some acronyms that we still utilize today. And certainly one of the first and foremost of those, when we talk about the core elements of those, fall under Chief John Norman's acronym, which was Coal was Wealth. And that Coal was Wealth had some origination. So for our listeners, just a little bit of perspective, Coal was Wealth was originated in 1991 in at the time Captain Norman's book, the Handbook of Fire Officers for Strategy and Tactics, where he talked about coal was wealth. And as Doug mentioned, it deals with some aspects of construction and occupancy, the area, the potential, life, water supply issues, apparatus and personnel, street conditions, weather, exposures, auxiliary appliances, location and extent of fire, time of day, and hazards. And it's interesting to note that in 1991, coming on the heels of a number of other pinnacle books for the fire service, go back to actually 1971, 72-ish, when Emanuel Fried, in his groundbreaking book on fireground tactics, or the Red Book as it's sometimes referred to, he started giving us some evaluation criteria, talking about evaluating the fire problem, talking about size up, dealing with life hazards, time of fire, dealing with building considerations, and so forth. And there's an entire evolutionary process from it. So that is sort of where we're at. But from the 90s throughout the early 2000s, and here we are in 2025, some things have remained very, very constant and have not changed based upon the increasing challenges of our building types, which go well beyond the 5 fundamental building types. We talk about the first and foremost of those in the Coal was Wealth acronym of construction. We have a lot of challenges. We have challenges in trying to identify, do I have a hybrid structure? What is the building type? What's the occupancy risk? And all of the other aspects that fall under them. I will say this before I turn it back over to you, Doug, is that, you know, we utilize these processes and these bullet points, and sometimes they're based upon an index card. Sometimes they're based upon just memory muscle that is inputted through our training, whether it be at the company or command or firefighter training, and all the way back to our certification and the textbooks that are out there. But it has to be, in my opinion, somewhat modified based upon the conditions and the types of structures, the types of buildings, and the types of occupancies and their risks that sometimes plug in other attributes to it. So I wanted to put that out because it's going to be important when we talk about these factors in some of our upcoming other part series, as part of the series that we'll talk a little bit more about. So it's dynamic, but Coal was Wealth fundamentally, I think, from both of our perspectives, is that we see a lot of it implemented, some things that sometimes get a little bit modified, especially with those departments and agencies that are utilizing the blue card system. But fundamentally, there's quite a bit of foundation that Chief Norman gave us with the Coal was Wealth acronym.
Well, Chris, you nailed that one down. So let's just dive straight into coal. Construction, of course, you know, buildings on fire. You talk a lot about construction. We've dovetailed construction into most everything that we've really done. Because to me, and I say this many times in classes, and I say it over and over, it's repetitive to the point I guess some people are probably tired of hearing it. But I relate the fire service and fire suppression activities and what we're doing to the military. And the way that I relate that is, in the military, you study your battleground and you learn it, you know, with great attention to detail. You have an intimacy with the battleground you're going to. You really understand it. You can predict it, those type of things. The same as what you do with your enemy, which for us would be fire. So taking the battleground and the enemy in the military, and taking the battleground being the buildings and the enemy being fire in our world, you kind of tie them together. So construction is really important. And we talk about construction, we talk about the compartmentalization, and we definitely talk about the company, which are the people that are there. You did mention in there about the 5 fundamentals of building construction. And of course, I go back to when I began working on all the rapid intervention team training programs. And one of the first components that I put in there was, how do you operate in these buildings? How do you really have to be thinking of rescuing firefighters and the dynamics that are going on in the building, the conditions, the degradation, the behavior of fire. So I picked up the phone and I called our good friend and longtime mentor, Francis Brannigan, and ask him, what should I be talking to these people about? What should they know about building construction? And he first, you got to realize Francis Brannigan was one of those guys. He was a no nonsense, cut to the chase. He said, you need to tell them there's 6 types of building construction. And I'm like, wait a minute, I teach your book and you only talk about 5. He said, yeah, it's because they won't let me put the other shit as a topic in there. And I had to get him to explain. When he dove down into this, Chris, and this is something that we've looked at with buildings that have a lot of hybrid style construction. In other words, multiple types of construction in it. We go back to our eras and vintages of buildings and when they've been remodeled, redesigned, rehabbed, occupancy, which is next to changes. Into that, they've added so much other stuff, and that changes everything about our size up. So anytime you talk about construction, anytime you begin looking at it, it requires you to get out into your streets, into your buildings, in your first do, your second do, and begin really looking at this. And let's dive into this construction concept. And what's your thoughts here?
Well, I think fundamentally, when we talk about construction, the American Fire Service, unfortunately, for many, default back to some very basic standards, which have fallen very short in terms of where we are today and what we should be doing. So fundamentally, when we discuss construction, we default back to the 5 fundamental building types. Those 5 fundamental building types are drawn out of the NFPA 220 standard on the classification of buildings. It has everything to do with fire resistiveness, the qualities of those buildings regarding code issues for building integrity. But the 5 fundamental building types, which unfortunately for many across the United States, whether it be metro size to the smallest ruralist organizations across America, we are losing a sense of accuracy and literacy of what those 5 fundamental building types are, what they have evolved into, and sometimes the misclassification of those regarding construction. So when we talk about building construction, we sometimes interface inaccurately or accurately a building construction type dealing with materials, or we talk about a building regarding its occupancy type or occupancy status and apply that into the fireground mix. We have to recognize that in the 70s and into the 1980s, it started into the 1960s, but it became more formalized in the 1970s and into the 1980s, that 20 plus year period. We talked about and had integrated into our fireground modeling what I call construction-based tactics. Construction-based tactics has everything to do with the typing of our building. If you recall back when we first started off in the fire service in that period of time, late 70s, early 80s, much of what we were seeing and what we were being exposed to and what we were being conditioned to in the classroom and in the training environment had everything to do with arriving on scene and sizing up the building relative to its occupancy type, whether it be a residential, and typically saying, I have a 2.5 story wood frame, a residential, and then getting into size up considerations in other factors dealing with fire location, fire intensity, and then immediately going into action. But construction-based tactics had everything to do with identifying one of those 5 construction types, the occupancy type, fire conditions, and then going to work. That is fundamentally what construction-based tactics have always sort of evolved around. When we talk more in the next layering or into the intermediate to the advanced levels of size up and building upon what Chief Norman was theorizing relative to the acronym, construction has a lot of variations. And construction in the world of FDNY in a large metropolitan urbanized areas such as that, there are very distinct building types that compromise first due areas, that compromise battalions and divisions and boroughs. That's pretty consistent. And in that kind of a world, there is a consistency. And also there's a different code that they utilize that is unlike everyone else. So now when we back up and take a look at across the nation, what the application of that acronym is, when we talk about construction, it does fall under the fundamentals of the NFPA 220 standard, but it deals with, do I have a building that is fire resistive? Is it non-combustible? Do I have ordinary construction or brick and joist construction? Is it heavy timber? And is it wood frame? But even with wood frame, let's utilize that, or as an example, wood framing can be everything from brace framing from the late 1800s, early 1900s. It can be heavy timbered type framing, which leads into the type 4 construction. It can be balloon framing. It can be platform framing. And it can also now be an inclusive of lightweight, or what I call, or as you both of us utilize, is engineered structural systems. It has evolved, and it does create another category of which there is no type 6, although Brannigan always alluded to it. Mike Turpak alludes to it quite specifically in his book on size up. And many, again, across the United States, as we've lectured and interfaced with our classes, we always have that question that gets posed, tell me a little bit about type 6 construction. Well, there is no type 6. We do have these hybrids that fall under a combination of different construction systems that might be type 2 construction, let's say fire resistive, or non-combustible, which is common in our commercial construction, and also have some degree, either a predominant or a sub-degree of wood framing. And typically that wood framing is going to be engineered structural systems, which go well beyond just lightweight construction. So just in that brief little question, you can see that there's a lot of things to unwrap. But the construction part is so important when we talk about sizing up our buildings, because when we talk about the fire conditions that may be present, that are in the compartment or within the building, within the voided areas of the building, it has everything to do with the building's resiliency, the integrity, how much time we have, that play an important role in the incident action plan. It has everything to do with the integrity for us to conduct the primary mission of the operation based upon the severity, the urgency, and the growth of the fire. And it has everything to do with the other component of COLE, which deals with the life safety component. So you can see how those two elements bookend into them. The construction part of it, which will lead into the occupancy part, which I'll leave for us to talk about a little bit further here. And then we talk about area relative to other factors that we can mention. But the construction, the life hazard that are part of that COLE, that initial component of it, are the bookends that has everything to do with initial stages, and has everything to do with our strategy, our tactics. They influence everything that we are going to do as we advance into that operation.
Well, this was part of the conversation I was having when I was in West Virginia here, real recent, in the southern part of the state, and riding into what is predominantly, I will call the coal fields of West Virginia, outside of Charleston, going back towards Logan, and was in Boone County. And one of the things that when I was going through doing a tactical component that they wanted, that they had asked for basically a day and a half of training on, we were doing size up and start talking about construction types and doing that. And I came in and utilized about 3 different ways of coming in or leaving in various parts as we were talking in the program, just so that I could get a better feel for what was in that area, because it's been a long time since I've been there. And what I began pointing out to them is they didn't know their district very well. In fact, the whole county didn't really understand their district as to what types of issues and problems that they really had based on construction, based on the type of occupancy and the complexities of the occupancy they had, things that had changed, the areas and the sizes of some of these that went in there. So they typically had the concept in their minds of, we go to residential fires because that's probably what they go to 99% of the time. However, they have coal mines, they have the processing plants, or what they call the tipples, that are there. I passed a juvenile center, which is there, which was a type 1 construction. I went by Dollar General's, which is type 2. I went by a variety of different types of small convenience stores, which range from type 2 to even type 3 and type 5. There was so much variety in there. And part of what I began talking to them about is the conditions, some of the changes, some of the buildings you could tell, even in the residential, that had renovation based upon the era and vintage. Obviously, one of the biggest pieces that we do get into when we get into construction is how tall, how high, how big, what's the location, all those type of pieces, because that goes back to the occupancy as well. So we're just going to eat this animal of coal right at one time here, and understand that the types of life hazards that go to it, and life hazards are really an important facet, because that's number one on every tactical component, is life safety, incident stabilization, property conservation. But one of the things I began pointing out to these folks is that these buildings, you have to understand what you're dealing with. And you alluded to that with the time periods, the types of construction, the changes, the variety of components that go to it. And it's not a cookie cutter deployment and based upon size. There are some of the residential structures that you see that we go deploying residential tactics on, you're going to get in trouble because they're commercial size. And we have to really begin looking at that for, the response to how much water, the size, the ability, determining what you have to have, and the ability to actually do searches for the life safety. There's a lot of things that go into that component that get in there. And we began talking about, okay, the time of day. Since COVID, a lot of things have changed. Now, I'm one of those guys, and I'll be honest, as time has went on in my world, the ability to get from the recliner to the bed has changed. Sometimes at 3 o'clock, I wake up out of the recliner. So it's the way that we were taught, anytime after about 10 o'clock at night or so, you need to be focused on bedrooms. And I don't say that that's still a bad concept. That should be something that's in your mind. But during COVID, when people went to working at home, and it didn't matter when they worked, they had to get certain amounts of things done. The office areas, the way that they changed things up from the COVID time period that we lived through to how offices and organizations and businesses and corporate world works is different. So it's not necessarily there. And I use the example of me being in the recliner, because a lot of times if I sit down in the recliner, it's over. Whenever I wake up is when I make it to the bedroom, if I make it to the bedroom. And that's something that you have to take into consideration when you're determining your search patterns. And of course, one of the things that we talk heavily about, and this is a good time to throw that in there, is we have to look at occupancy profiling. And again, looking at the type of occupancy it is, profiling the occupancy, and then the survivability. Is it occupancy profiling positive or negative? Is it survivability positive or negative? Where would these people be? What's survivable? What's not survivable? Being able to determine that through identifying, quote unquote, not only just construction, but the fire behavior, the dynamics that are there that we talked about in the very front end. So let's dive back into this. Let's just devour this whole word of coal with the acronym here, and talk about occupancies and areas and the challenges that we're really up against.
Well, you sort of nailed it right on the head a moment ago, Doug, when he talked about one size does not fit all. And I think that's what you were alluding to. You know, we have different building types. We have different buildings of era and vintage. And again, for our listeners' edification, we talk a lot on both of our shows, a lot about era and vintage when we get into strategy and tactics and operations. We've done programs on mega mansions, commercial firefighting, residentials. We talked about row houses. Again, each building type, inclusive of the footprint, the size, the volume, the square footage of that building or complex of buildings and tenant spaces, whether we have residential, a series of residential spaces, meaning residential compartments that comprise a residence. Are they stacked? Are they next to each other? Is it a single family residential? Is it a duplex quad? Is it a row house? Is it a building built in the late 1800s? Or is it a garden apartment or townhouse series that was built here in 2010? So when we talk about occupancy and we talk about area and potential, that potential, although it has some relationships back to the firefighting portion of it, and that's a little bit further on in the acronym when we talk about location and the extent of fire, the area and the potential really has everything to do sort of on the front end with some of the fire conditions. So we talk about occupancy typing or occupancy status. So occupancy type, residential. When we talk about an era and vintage regarding construction, you know, again, does it afford a certain type of footprint? What's the square footage? Am I dealing with a mega mansion residential, or am I dealing with a Cape Cod? Distinctively different. Maybe 900 to 1,000 square feet on the smaller end, and maybe upwards of 30, 40, or 50,000 square feet or more on the higher end, dealing with a mega mansion and such. So the area and the potential has a lot to do with the next portion of it when we talk about the life issues or life hazards and risks associated with, do I have enough apparatus and personnel, which gets into a little bit in the next portion of the acronym, but resources, what's on the box alarm, how does that play out? So you can see that these are integral, they are not linear. So in other words, one does not directly affect the other. It does and it doesn't. They continuously have this influence that I think is important for our listeners to recognize. This is not a linear process. One does not just account for the construction, the area, the potential, the life, getting into the water supply, the apparatus in the street. I mean, it is sort of a cohesive, integral, interrelated element that falls upon the first due size up of the company officer. Am I doing a dashboard size up? Am I coming out of the cab and doing a curbside size up? Am I doing on the run size up? Again, that's something that Chief Brunacini talked about when he introduced the fireground commander model, and talking about both stationary size up and command, and also size up, command, and other aspects dealing with sort of on the run or mobile. So we have the 360 that has been introduced into the fire service for the last 25 years. We talk about interior size up, exterior size up, geographical or divisional size up. I mentioned about company officer size up. There's also the first due command officer size up that looks at occupancy, construction, life hazard, area, and potential. Because again, that's going to relate back to, do I have enough personnel? Do I have enough resources on that first alarm assignment? Am I a single unit response resource that showed up, either the engine that's arrived on scene or some other apparatus? They're doing a size up. We identify that we've got something a lot more either that's obvious or potentially present. Again, when we talk about area and potential, what's showing, what's not showing, what can we anticipate, and do I have enough resources? So this is a very fluid process that all four of those are very integral. And then especially when we get into the WAS, dealing with water, apparatus, and street conditions, these are all integral to it. So it is much more than what we have reduced it down to. And that is part of the problem. We try to simplify something that has a lot of complexities, and we try to, and we see many in the profession that start removing certain pieces, whether we talk about Cole's Wealth, we talk about the fireground tactics model that Emmanuel Fried gave us. that really started expanding upon some things. He started talking about height and area of the building, the construction, fire location, the extent. So we simplify it, but we can't. We there's a series of subsets that each one has. So we talked about the construction, typing, era, vintage. They are going to be occupancy based. There's going to be occupancy characteristics that fall out of that. That again, we've got to go from general residential upon the arrival in terms of an occupancy. Well, is that occupancy? What's the occupancy status? Is it occupied? Is it in use? Is it for sale? Or, is there a for sale sign? Is it a derelict, abandoned building that is a residential occupancy that is not in use? That may create other strategic and tactical challenges that we get into. Again, is it survivable space? How many, what's even the square footages, and what type of spaces do we have? So there's a lot of subsets to it, Doug, as we get into it, that hopefully our listeners are recognizing that depending upon what they've been exposed to or trained in, and what they are getting in their various contexts, whether it be out of the academies and out of the formal schools, whether it be just the standard type of training they're getting in their certification, or in the absence of formal certification training at their state level, what are they getting in terms of their initial or continuing in-service training, in terms of their drills and activities that they're being exposed to. There's going to be a gap, and that gap, unfortunately, is pretty significant, which we are trying to provide some bullet points here in this program, which I think are very, very important. One of the things that we did on my program, on our Buildings on Fire program, a couple of months back, we ran a couple of programs and a couple of episodes talking about reading the building, which is somewhat along the same vein of some focused areas dealing with specific building reads that one would look at. We're being a little bit generic here, but I think we'll eventually talk about those in our upcoming episodes on your program. So we're just laying the groundwork here, but construction, occupancy, the area sizes, the footprint, the configuration, the layout, these are very common. So if I'm talking about that Cape Cod, there's a certain type of square footages, certain type of volume, a certain number of program spaces, bedrooms, living rooms, parlors, kitchens, and so forth. What's the potential in terms of size and fire conditions, and obviously the life hazards that fall under them, which leads into the next part of it. If I've got a fire in a Cape Cod, I should have an appreciation of what my gallon per minute flow rate may be, what my apparatus and personnel needs are going to be, but that is distinctively different at 1,000 square feet footprint and the siting of that versus, let's say, that 20,000 square footprint large area residential, which has a greater number of occupiable spaces, conditions, and volumes that get into gallon per minute flow rates and risks and hazards. So that's sort of the snapshot on those particular veins, just based upon what you set up as the premise here a moment ago.
And I know I talked to those folks going in, and we began identifying buildings, and especially if you go back to the series that we did in the program that I did at FDIC 2 years ago with the challenges of resort fires and responses. There's an apartment building on the way into the fire department. I was going to the Racine Fire Department, and it's like eight apartments or something to that effect. But the backside, you don't even see the backside. You don't see the downside apartments because it's kind of masked by the topography, and we see that. And that's a prime example. I even threw the cases out of in San Francisco and in San Diego and places like that had it, but related it back to the area that I was in. But we could talk about that. I mean, that's all over the United States. I just gave a couple of good examples there, but we have to look at this and eating the construction, the occupancy, the area, and the height, and the life hazards. Again, you hit something that's very important to me is a lot of rhetoric out there, and sometimes people get very passionate in their banters about this with the life hazard, and buildings are not cleared until you clear them. Well, I have no issues with that whatsoever. In fact, I'm 100% in agreement with them that a building is not cleared until the fire department clears it. But at what point is it safe to clear? What point is the building survivable, not only for the victims, but for you to be in there? You mentioned the derelict structures, and I don't know how many of those I passed in that area just because of the economic depression and the times of the changes and some of those. Um, Even if it is occupied and it's under degradation by fire, how long can you operate in the building? How well is it going to help you? What's the chances of survivability based upon the design of the building and the openness and all those layouts? And that's the stuff you have to take into consideration. And again, I call it a cookie cutter. There is no such thing as a quote unquote a cookie cutter. You have to look at every single aspect. And I think people take size up as pulling up and saying, yeah, I got a building, it's 2 stories, it's a residential, it may be type 5, but that's the end of it. They're not truly sizing up the building. And one of the pieces that I touched upon about being able to identify the area and the height, but also identifying the location of the fire, which will come up, was utilization of thermal imaging cameras in your size up. That's critical to telling you what the fire is doing, about what the building is showing you. There's a lot of things that can go in there. And of course, if we really kind of get into this other piece of the puzzle here with coal, was, what your tactic is going to be able to be based upon your water supply. How fast can you establish a water supply? In some of these buildings, do you even have some type of auxiliary appliances such as a fire suppression system? And that's something we have to take into consideration too, Chris. As time has gone on, we've seen more NFPA 13R systems go in, NFPA 13 systems go in. Some of the residential sprinkler systems that have shown up and put in. Of course, we both have a mutual friend and Jim Smith out of Virginia, who worked with Henrico County, who built his house way back off the road. In fact, he bought a large piece of land. It's about 3/4 of a mile up his driveway. And one of the first things he put in was a sprinkler system. Even though he's on a well, it's a pressure system. He put that in because he understood the fact of, fire suppression and all. It does have a connection. It's on the side of the house. But again, we began looking at all these pieces, and I use that 3/4 of a mile up a driveway in a rural setting as the streets. And, we're challenged with some of that here recently. I know that the South here and across the southern part of the world got hammered with snow. We're not used to that down here. Even though I grew up in snow, it was not like a big deal to me. I always kind of chuckle at them. Growing up in West Virginia, I saw 64 inches one time. I tell them I want to see 65 so I could be impressed. But, the street conditions, being able to respond and, what are you capable of during the hurricanes? One of the pictures I show in the slideshow with Coal Was Wealth, when I'm talking about size up, actually has a picture of the hurricane when we had a building on fire that we were drafting out of the streets because of the water. And of course, you get into a lot of the other pieces of how tight it is, how you can maneuver, how you can set up. That's a big consideration for us in establishing a water supply plan, and where you're dropping your drop tank, where you're positioning your relay pumpers, if you're laying down long driveways in the rural settings, and how you're leaving positioning for apparatus. And I talk about that too, being an old truck guy at one time. Is don't make me carry my ladders down the street, forever. Give me prime real estate. I got to have prime real estate, and just tons of stuff that go into this. And I want our listeners, and I think you would agree with me, is I want our listeners really to begin understanding that it's not just running an acronym. It's taking that acronym and truly digesting it to the degree that we need to understand every single aspect of what we're doing. It's not just emotion. And I tell a story about an individual I had that I was checking off to be an acting officer at one point in time in my career, and went to the drill ground, set up a scenario, let him run as the officer. I was his firefighter. Comes off the rig, walks around the building, comes back. We're going in this door right here. We're deploying a hose line. we go in, we get to the second division, and here's a mannequin with a leg hanging out the window. And he turns around and he said, I messed up, didn't I? And I'm like, well, let's stop here and have a conversation. I said, you went around the building. What were you looking at? Well, nobody really told me. They told me I was supposed to walk around the building, so I did. So what are we really training our people with? And, I focus a lot on the training aspect. What are we training our people? What are we educating them with? What are we giving them for knowledge? And I think that's something we got to get into is with coal was wealth. And specifically in this component, the coal was, what level of knowledge do you have? And I'm going to throw something out here. And I did this on my webinar that I did for fire engineering recently with kind of teasing folks with what's going to happen at FDIC with developing the next generation. But I am a firm believer in we have got to teach knowledge before tactics. You have to understand, or in other words, the why before the how. If you understand the knowledge or the why you're doing something, why it's important, what's the true underlying messages, or what's the true underlying information. When we tell you or you learn a tactic or a skill, then it's applicable to what you're doing. And in the modern world of education, and if you don't believe it, ask your kids that are doing modern math or coming home with modern math. And being the fact that I have a secondary education degree in science and math, that math's different from what I learned in math through the years to be able to teach. But everything has a science behind it, and being able to quantify and qualify what you're doing. So the knowledge piece that we need to be teaching our folks, the amount of knowledge they need to have about construction and the construction types and what they look like and what the buildings are, how the buildings perform, what's going to happen. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. With the occupancy, what type of occupancy? You did mention something that I was going to get to, but you nailed it on the head. Is the building occupied, or is it truly abandoned? If it's abandoned, it means it's not capable of being occupied without a bunch of work or changes. If it's vacant or got a for sale sign on it, as you put it, somebody could occupy that tomorrow. And one of the pieces that comes out, Chris, you've heard this, and we've had this banner conversation with some folks, is, well, what about the homeless people or people that are living in there? I don't disagree that does happen, but how many times have we had a fire fatality of homeless people inside of a building versus those folks probably started the fire, got out. Now we're going in a building that may not be conducive for us to be there. And there's a whole report on that out of Baltimore that people.
Well, it goes back to risk. I mean, what is the actual or perceived risk, which is part of the size up process when we identify risk factors, both in terms of fire severity, which are either known or projected, things that are obvious, things that may not be obvious based upon the depth and location of fire within the building. So there's fire conditions that are going to be apparent or based on their location are going to be within the compartment. That's that space. Is that space occupiable? Yes or no? It also goes back to what are the risks associated with that space in its occupancy status. Is it in use? Is it closed? Is it occupied? Is it unoccupied? Is it inherently a derelict building that has a probability of occupancy? And again, if it does, who are the potential individuals that may be occupying it? So it goes back into, again, if the building is sized up to be a derelict building, there are clearly going to be some identifiable parameters of that building that, when recognized and comprehended in that size up process, should lead to some considerations and factors that influence your decision making strategically and tactically. Then you look at probability, which gets into another category that should set you in motion based upon what is consistent and common to the area, or maybe an anomaly. In other words, I'm in the middle of the Corn Belt in the middle of the United States in a small community that may have a few or a number of buildings of a certain construction and occupancy type that may be vacant based upon economic distress or other factors. So what is the probability and the likelihood of someone other than the normal tenants that may have owned it or previously owned it, they may be present? What is the population of potential homelessness in that geographical area? So it gets into a whole series of other factors that go back into this recognition of pattern, identifying what's common to your first due. Even you mentioned about the street conditions. Well, when Chief Norman talked about that in the context of Cole was wealth, that's really a very specific consideration in a metro or urban environment based on time of day of week, and other factors in which street accessibility may influence a lot of other factors in your sizing up and delay of response. And suddenly you're the first due, you're turning down a street, and that street is clogged up with other vehicles that have been parked based upon alternate street parking, or maybe inaccessible based upon characteristics of how old that first due response area is, that even limits the response of an apparatus when there is street side parking, or is there a festivity or other activity going on. So in certain environments, that may be a critical factor. In others, again, we may be in the middle of other communities in which street conditions have no consideration other than maybe an environmental or weather related condition, hurricane, tornado conditions, snow, rain, flooding, things of that nature. So in my world, based upon time of year, accessibility and of street conditions is going to be an environmental concern. Winter months, has it been plowed? Did the public works plow get down a particular area, or are we going to have to situate ourselves in a particular corner and hand jack that equipment into the side street due to those other considerations? So there are a lot of variables. They are very specific, first due or geographical or community based. So again, we all are familiar with what our first dues are, and that first due may be different than someone else's first due or our community makeup and consideration. So everything that is part of Cole was wealth potentially leads into other series of categories that create these subsets. So it is a global basis for one to start thinking about cognitively and its application, but it has to be geared for a particular type of building, your first due, era, vintage, construction, fire conditions, and so forth. So I think we're planting the seed, Doug. We're planting the seed about how it really becomes much more adaptive versus prescriptive. So the one thing I think is important for our listeners, especially those that may not have a lot of fire responses and frequency of responses and severity of incidents and so forth, they need to understand that this is the basis to draw from, to build upon. They are consistent with the methodologies, but we've got to get away from prescriptive-based size up to a much more adaptive and just plugging in other features. In what we're trying to point out here was with what the classical acronym of Cole was wealth really established. Although there's a lot of others, you talk about the slicer concept that has some criteria to it. There are many other colleagues of ours around the United States that have some other acronyms, including ourselves, right? But when we take a look at what's consistently written and what should be more familiar with our individuals, there's the blue card size up about structures and buildings and occupancies. There's Norman's, which we're talking about here, and then everyone else's, and then the stuff that really is generic. We go back to this default about, well, I don't need to do size up. All I need to do is I've got a particular building, it's a residential, it's a particular age that I'm not even familiar with or not considering, but I've got a fire, I've got potentially someone in place, and it's all manual level effort, stretch the line, go in, and we're not sizing up, we're not evaluating, we're not considering time, tactical windows, and all of the other attributes that are important to consider about building an occupancy, life hazard, the square footages, the volume, the availability of personnel, the availability of apparatus, initial water supply. And the one thing that I'll just make the point about what you just mentioned is the sustainability of that water. Do I have just a limited water supply on tank water? Do I have a hydrant? Do I have tankers and tenders that are going to be coming in that are going to provide that sustainability. There's, what's the consistency? What's the sustainability? Am I going to have a gap? Well, these are all going to influence your operations. And I think by now our listeners should recognize there's a lot of working parts to this, and that's where experience and training and knowledge all collectively come together, especially the knowledge part of it. I think it's first and foremost, if we talk about the importance of coal was as those two pieces in the size up modeling, you've got to know your buildings. You've got to understand the variables of occupancy type and occupancy risk, era and vintage. But building construction is fundamental, and I think is the most significant foundation from which everything else builds upon.
And I completely agree. While we're sitting here talking, I don't know if you've noticed, I've looked down a couple of times and picked up pagers, and it's like 4 different types of fire events going on right now in my world. One was a structure fire. There was a mention of a child, or but it sounded like the fire was very limited, or if not out already. But that drives me back to the bookend of coal with life hazard component. And again, a lot of times people want to accuse various ways of communicating about all the aspects of things of, oh, you don't care about life hazard, or you're putting it down. No, everything we're talking about here, and I want our listeners to understand that we're probably 2 of the most aggressive people when it comes down to tactical deployments, when it comes to life safety and being able to do that. What we're trying to do is educate you on a larger perspective of understanding of how all that impacts life safety. And even though it's our primary factor that drives most of our tactics, that if you pull up and obviously nobody is there, and it's verified that nobody's in the building, because I'm the only one that lives here and I'm out front here, that kind of changes things. But it does help us focus on our strategies and tactical deployments. But everything else that's wrapped around here, with the construction, the occupancy, the area and the height, the water supply, the personnel, the street conditions, all that comes into play. Because if I'm going to do life hazard, and I tell the stories of 2 cases, especially when we're talking about search and rescue, and I can remember going to a call, and this has been many, many years ago. In fact, the picture is over on my bookshelf there of where we pulled out. In fact, I probably ought to just go over there and pull it up. But Doug Kelly and I went inside this building. It was light haze. It wasn't much smoke at all. It was reported fire. Companies got in there, had a very small fire in behind the dryer. It was actually the vent. But as we rolled in there, it was kind of simultaneous that the truck and the engine got there. And of course, our job was to do searching, and we had a report that the lady was still in the building. So it was pretty well verified. It was an apartment style construction. It was type 5 construction. We weren't seeing anything that was indicated of structural compromise. We were reading the building. We were reading the smoke. They were stretching lines. We went in, and we got to this little lady who went back and laid on a bed. And she was an older lady. And when we got to her, she looked up, and of course, it's kind of like Mutt and Jeff showing up. Doug Kelly's about 6'5", and I'm about 5'9". So it was kind of odd, 2 guys standing there. And she looks up and goes, "Oh, it's the Angels." And I said, "No, ma'am, we're the truck company. We're here to help." So we grabbed this lady, and of course, we could have tried to get her out of a window. We'd had to change some things. The back door was not close. So we went right back the way we came, probably the closest route. And that's one of the things we teach about search and rescue, is getting people to fresh air as fast as possible, not trying to drag them back through the worst environments that we can, getting them into conducive environments that are for survivability. Fast forward a number of years into the early years of me being here. This has probably been about 12 and a half years ago of being in Horry County, right at shift change, dispatched to a condo townhome style building. And imagine, say 5, 6, units This one's in the middle. When you walk in to the front door, you immediately walk in and you can go up the steps. Off to the left is the living room and the kitchen. The living room kitchen divided by a counter, upstairs 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, half bath underneath, staircase, big front bay window out front. Um, Somebody decided, of course, when we get into all the things that we talk about with fire dynamics and what people do, a bystander broke that window out front, a big bay picture style window. And then they did put a garden hose in there, heavily involved living room area, large amount of content in that area that was flammable. Right at shift change. So you know what happens at shift change? Everybody's going to a fire, right? So everybody was loaded on the rigs, lots of people, which in some cases you don't have that. In some cases, you may be showing up with 1 or 2 people to have to try to deploy tactics. But again, showed up, deployment of lines, the reported and confirmed by the lady that her quote unquote baby was in there. They confirmed that it was a human. Last known location was upstairs. Crew comes in into the main door, turns left, protects the stairwell. Crews go by them to go upstairs to begin searching. They kill the fire, good amounts of water. And that's something we'll talk about as we go along with the water supply, is how much water did you bring with you? How much can you deploy? We'll talk about that in a subsequent show of ours. But killed the fire, searched off the line, found a victim in behind the counter, face down, back door right there in the kitchen. They go straight out, and of course, immediately they begin, medical care, paramedics, the whole 9 yards. They actually do a rapid sequence intubation, get her to Grand Strand, and then they fly her out to Augusta. She survives. The lady that was in a very minor amount of smoke does not survive because of anoxia. Again, type of smoke, positioning, age. There's lots of factors that go with that. But both of those were driven by this coal was wealth concept in understanding and sizing up. But again, that bookend that you mentioned, and I'll call it a bookend because I really believe it is, it's a pillar in what we do with this life safety, is a driving force that really tells us what we're going to do or what we're going to have to do to be successful if we're going to save lives, if there are savable lives. And that's the piece that I get down to. So occupancy and time of day, that's a big one. And the occupancy
and the tactical window. I mean, it goes back to that fire component. So as we're sizing up and we're evaluating, that based upon the pre-arrival data and information, again, it's probability of what is the severity and what's the impact going to be on potential victims, known or suspected. It's going to be risk factors in order to initiate actions, whether it be suppression or in support of the rescue mission. And again, it all goes back, and it goes back to the viability of the environment. So when we talk about construction and the occupancy and life hazard, the life hazard also has to be paramountly considered to the firefighting forces and the companies. What is our risk of working in, around, underneath, on top of structural systems, components, the compartment? What's the integrity of the floor system? What's the integrity of the roof system, the wall areas? For us to conduct the primary mission, and that is to support the life safety of those that are either known or suspected to be trapped in that building. We are not going to be any good if we fall through the floor and suddenly we divert from the mission of trying to rescue someone to now going into a Mayday situation. So fundamentally, we've got to understand that these are very fluid processes. There are distinctive, continuous fluid size-ups from arrival at the company, both interior and exterior. That's something that we seldom talk about, and I think we will more than likely discuss in one of the upcoming episodes. But there is exterior size-up, and there's also a vastly underutilized interior size-up that at the company level, we need to be utilizing all hands that are watching and looking and getting these observations and sensory perceptions that are identified and comprehended, and then communicated back to command, because there's going to be interior conditions within that compartment, in that occupancy, that we can be picking up upon that may not be identifiable from the outside. that are part of the continuing process of size up. So, there's a lot of moving parts here, and I'll only add this one little added note here when we talk about size up of our buildings. We've been talking about just some of the attributes that Chief Norman, coming out of Cole was Wealth, in that definitive book in 1991. But size up actually was first written in the American Fire Service in 1932. The first textbook for the American Fire Service that was written for the fire service specifically was the IAFC, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the Fire Chiefs Handbook. That was the first edition. The author was Fred Shepard. In 1932, it was published. And in that definitive book, they were trying to collectively put together all of the best practices that were being presented at the time during the 1920s. Again, we are talking about 100 years ago. Here we are in 1925. That book was first identified in terms of a need in 1928, and then in 1932 it was published. But in that book was the first terminology that was applied regarding size up. And guess what? When they talked about size up, they started talking about the building, they talked about fire conditions and some other factors that all related back to interior firefighting. So I'll just put that little snippet out there because I'm sure we'll talk about it in the upcoming episodes to tie that back in. And actually, the other end note to all of this is that even Chief Norman's sort of, for better words, or the orientation and the sequencing of the components of size up was done to provide an acronym. So it's not, the acronym itself does not always indicate the priority of or the importance of a letter and what that letter may mean. He oriented it so that it would give us this Cole was Wealth acronym that could be memorized to be part of a process that, again, can be interchanged in terms of what's important, as long as we remember what they may be and then apply them. But that was first termed actually all the way back into the 1930s. And again, some of the particulars, those bullet points were just reorganized and put into a different arrangement, whether we talk about what was presented in the Fire Chiefs Handbook in both the 1932 edition, the 1962 edition, what insights Chief Lloyd Lehman gave us in the 1950s, some things that Charles Walsh in the early 1960s gave us, Warren Kimball in the mid-60s, and then building upon what Emmanuel Freed, Chief Brunacini, and then Chief Norman, and then others that have given us. So there's a lot of things that we'll talk about here in the upcoming episodes, but again, I think we've painted a really good picture here in the initial phases of this part one episode to give our listeners some food for thought.
Well, let's actually jump and talk a little bit about what we have in store for our listeners, combining Buildings on Fire and Fire and Training together. Let's talk a little bit about what our plan is. We kicked it off here with talking about size up, and Cole was Wealth is kind of a kickoff where we'll finish one section of Fire and Training, a part of that with the wealth part with weather exposures, apparatus, location, extent of the fire, time, and then anything to do with hazards or materials or things like that. But let's talk about how we're going to blend two shows together and what we're going to do to how we can actually interweave the dynamics of both shows and what our concepts are, Chris.
Well, I think, we talk about Buildings on Fire, we're talking about everything to do with the building, obviously. And then we're talking about the training component. And I think what our listeners can anticipate is that, and you mentioned this a few moments ago, Doug, we talk about size up, and it's become much more than just the acronym as a foundation. We talk about reading the fireground, reading the building, reading the company, and reading the compartment. These are size up considerations. We are evaluating. We are looking at factors there that all support the mission and support the incident action plan. So we will delve into some other aspects. I think our next episode will discuss all of the bullet points and the lettering of what coal was wealth, what the intent has always been. I think it's important to expand a little bit further about all of these other pieces that really give us a much more adaptive versus a prescriptive fireground. However you memorize these components, just recognize that you've got to apply the right size up considerations for the right context of building, occupancy, and either known or identified or suspected fire conditions. Those are going to create a series of cascading insights that you've got to utilize critical thinking, situational awareness, and putting those together to lead you into the strategic and tactical incident action plan. So we are going to talk a little bit more about some specifics on size up considerations dealing with the building and occupancy. We'll talk a little bit more about, I think, some of the training component on your show, but we're going to have some very useful insights on how to apply size up in your first due, in your area, your community. But whatever your first due is, take into account the breadcrumbs that we are providing some insights on, and see how that works relative to your organization, your community risks, your building types, your composition of your first due in your department, your station, your companies that are going out in the streets.
So just to give our listeners a little thought process here is, over the next couple of months, you're going to be wanting to tune in not only to fire and training, but also to buildings on fire, as we dovetail both of these programs together with lots of knowledge, lots of insights, lots of conversation and dialogue. And then we're going to be at FDIC.
Yeah, that's I was waiting for you to say that. So
yeah, FDIC, and we'll obviously be on the main floor in the connector areas. I call it the hub, is what I call it.
I think they called it the fishbowl, didn't they?
Yeah, they call it.
I remember, or the hub, but I got the fishbowl was good because for those of you that are attending FBIC, again, stop by depending upon when they do come up with the scheduled dates and times. That'll be all published in advance. But if you are attending FDIC, please swing by. You can watch us do our live pod and webcast right there from the quarters of FDIC, and then we'll be looking forward to having some conversation and dialogue with you once our show is completed right there. So I would anticipate, Doug, that based upon our planning, we will talk about some specifics on size up in that combined episode and program right there live from FDIC.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Of course, I think we're both on Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah.
My program with developing the next generation of fire service leaders, which has a new little twist that's going to be thrown in there that you don't want to miss. Last year, the folks that didn't get into the program, if they're back, I'm hoping that they will take an opportunity to come in.
Yeah.
I felt really bad when they were turning people away, but I'm hoping that they get an opportunity to come back in and sit in there. And of course, your Wednesday afternoon, I think we're about the same time.
Late in the day, doing tactical risks. So again, for our listeners, some great programs that are going to be coming out that are on the preliminary publication of some of the classes there at FDIC. If you're not familiar with some of the programs, number one, even if you're not familiar with FDIC, which is highly unlikely, but take a look at some of the preliminary schedules that are being published, as well as what we're going to be doing there on that Wednesday, our podcasting at some point during the course of the week. But again, Doug, exceptional program relative to what you're going to be doing again this year. And for our listeners, again, for a tactical approach, we're going to do some tactical considerations on the first due, look at building risks, some size of consideration. So it'll dovetail right in with some of the conversations we're having here today.
Well, Chris, it's always a pleasure anytime we get together and we can have conversation and dialogue and share with folks. That's how we got where we were at, is because people sit down and had conversations and shared their knowledge with us. And that's our goals, is to be able to share backwards. And we're looking forward to part 2 of fire and training with size up. And we'll be diving into wealth and relating everything back into the complete acronym of coal is wealth. And again, talking about some of the building facts and things that we're going to be doing on your show. over the next couple of months. Just super excited, and I hope our listeners are as excited about it as we are. So until the next time we all get together, I want to challenge you to get out into the streets. I want you to get out into your first due territories. I want you to begin studying your buildings. I want you to become a student of your district and recognize and begin tactically planning out, or pre-planning, as we say, what's in your districts and what you're facing against. I think that is a very, very critical piece that we have to do. Fire and training is dedicated to the men and women who serve in our streets 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We focus our efforts on providing the best knowledge and training and education that we can so that everyone goes home. Till the next time we're together, stay safe. We'll see you soon, and look forward to seeing you on behalf of Chris and myself at FDIC 2025.